Hello, everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to Project Venus Divorce Resource, choosing the right path for you and your family. I'm Nicole Young, the Marketing Coordinator for Private Vista, and your host for today. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit about our firm, Private Vista. Private Vista is a financial planning and wealth management firm in the Chicagoland area. We manage approximately $1.7 billion of assets for our clients, and we have offices in both downtown Chicago and Oak Brook. We specialize in working with women in transition, business executives, business owners, retirees, families, and qualified plans. Next, I have just a few housekeeping items to ensure that you're able to have the best webinar experience. You will notice that you'll be muted for the duration of our presentation. This is just to ensure that everyone can hear our panelists clearly. If you run into any technical issues, you may reach out to me, Nicole Young, by using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Any chats that are sent will be completely confidential and will only be seen by me for today's session. Lastly, if you'd like to submit a question during the presentation, please email me at pvnews@myprivatevista.com. That's it for housekeeping. Now I'd like to turn things over to Nicole Romito.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Mary Beth and I co-founded Project Venus, where women in transition are connected, supported, and inspired to enrich their lives through financial planning, education, and partnership. Both of us are passionate about providing women access to the information and resources they need to move from a place of feeling overwhelmed and anxious to a place of confidence and clarity. Since we are holding our events virtually, we have opened these sessions to both men and women who are either thinking about or perhaps already going through a divorce. So before we start answering all of the questions that you've submitted, each of us will take a moment to give you a little bit background on what we do. I'll go ahead and start. As you know, I'm Nicole Romito. I am a lead advisor and partner with Private Vista. I've been in the financial services industry my entire career, and I really enjoy and am so grateful to be able to help people tune out all the noise that is out there in today's world about their financial situation. And in particular, when someone is thinking about or going through a divorce, to be able to be their trusted partner and sounding board and help them both during the divorce as part of their team, so they understand the decisions that they're making, but also to work with them ongoing as they begin their next chapter. Mary Beth, we'd love to hear a little bit about you.
Thanks, Nicole. Like Nicole, I am also a lead advisor and partner at Private Vista, and Nicole Young already gave you the background on our firm. But as with Nicole, my entire career has been spent in the financial services industry. I started at a bank that eventually became JP Morgan Chase, and then migrated over to what we call the registered investment advisory firm, independent advisors that worked with clients like yourselves for financial management and financial planning and investment management. I also have an MBA, and Nicole and I are both what we call CFPs, which is a designation that is Certified Financial Planner, which means that we've also taken additional classes and had to pass a competency exam. But it also, most importantly, means that we have a fiduciary responsibility to do what is truly right for our clients. So, and because of that, we always do want to be part of your team for people going through divorce, as Nicole's already mentioned, because there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. And when you're emotionally upset, we want to make sure that you're making the right decision. So I'm going to hand the baton over to Joe, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Mary Beth. My name is Joe Emmerth. I'm the owner and founder of Emmerth Divorce Law, LLC. I've been a family and divorce attorney for 16 years. Before I was an attorney, I was a therapist. So that gives me a little bit of insight into the troubles that people go through during this difficult process. I represent clients, both men and women, across Northern Illinois, from Chicago all the way out to DeKalb and parts in between. I've been voted a super lawyer and leading lawyer by my peers. And I was formerly the chair of the Illinois State Bar Association Committee on Judicial Evaluations. That's enough about me. Let me hand it over to Lydia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Lydia Richardson. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm also a collaborative divorce coach, child and family specialist, and mediator. I am president-elect of Collaborative Divorce Illinois this year, looking forward to being president for 2022. And I'm really happy to be here, part of this panel and this group, because as everyone has said, I very much enjoy the opportunity to help anyone going through a divorce work on a team with other professionals who also have their heart in the right place about helping families get through divorce the best way possible. I, unlike most psychologists and coaches, also had a finance background. I actually was an economics major undergrad originally, and way back in the dinosaur days, worked on Wall Street for a couple years. All that to say, I have more of a business problem-solving oriented mind, but I also know very well that I am not the financial expert here. I never will be on a divorce team, and I know well how important they are. So glad to be here. Hope we can be of help.
Thank you, everybody, for your introductions. Now that you know a little bit about our panelists, let's start answering some questions. So I'm going to start off with a question for everybody, and maybe let's have Nicole Ramito kick us off. The question is going to be, what are the different divorce processes and the related pros and cons? How do I choose the right one for my family?
That's a great question. I will certainly start us off, but definitely know that all of everyone on the panel can and will chime in. Many people are familiar with what we call the traditional approach to divorce. It's oftentimes what's portrayed on TV or the movies. It's known as traditional or litigation. In the past, I would say several decades, depending on what part of the United States you live in, there's been other ways that have become more popular and common. The one thing that I want to lead off with, and I know we all agree on, is there's no one right way. It really depends on your family, your relationship, and the situation and what is causing the divorce. So our role here is to not champion one way over the other or say always do it this way, but just to make sure you understand that there are choices in the process when you're deciding to get a divorce. And we want to educate you on them because oftentimes we find that many people will hire an attorney at the beginning, and depending on what area the attorney either only operates in or prefers to operate in, that may be, again, not always, that may be the direction that they kind of guide you in. So what I'm thinking is I'll just list the different ways, and then why don't we as a group, we can talk about them a little bit from the different aspects of our professional backgrounds. And then also too, as all things in life, there's pros and cons to each process. So the first one we talked about was, I'll call it traditional or litigation. Then there's also ADR or alternative dispute resolution. And there's two main processes under that, mediation and then collaboration. There's also one that's not an official one, but we all know it occurs, and it's the cooperation. And then I'm going to put it last, and Joe, you can certainly, well, actually, I know you won't differ on this one, but there is also pro se. So that would be where you choose to represent yourself. I'll let Joe comment on that one, but I will say that will be the one we'll spend the least amount of time on. So I would say maybe why don't we start off with the traditional or litigation. And Joe, since you're the attorney, and oftentimes people, that's the first professional they decide to research when putting together their team.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, the traditional form of divorce is litigation. That's where each side gets their own attorney, and they utilize the court system and the judges to move the case along. Some of the pros are that you've got your own dedicated attorney who's looking out for your best interests alone. Doesn't matter what your spouse wants, doesn't matter what your spouse's goals are. They are your champion and they represent you alone. The cons are that it puts you immediately into an adversarial system. And when people fight, matters tend to drag out longer and be more expensive. And then ultimately, if you can't reach some sort of settlement, you're going to let some stranger in a black robe, who's probably seen 20 cases that day already, decide things that are going to affect your life for the next 20 or 30 years. So those are some of the pros and cons of litigation. Maybe Lydia could talk a little bit about collaborative and mediation.
Oh, what makes you think I might know about that? Well, I'll start by saying I agree 100%, Nicole. You know, that I think our purpose today here is to make sure that you all just get some education about the fact that there are many options out there. Obviously, as someone who's very involved with Collaborative Divorce Illinois and the International Association of Collaborative Professionals, I'm almost always going to be a proponent of that type of approach. But I agree 100% with what Joe and Nicole said, which is that it is not for everybody. I wish that it were. But what I will tell you is that collaborative divorce, mediated divorce, cooperative, we sometimes say collaborative with a small c, all of those are alternative forms of dispute resolution that are going to be most useful for people who are getting divorced, who are able to collaborate with each other, who are able to talk about it. And I'm going to say anyone who has a family, I'm always going to make that as my first recommendation, if possible, because our goal with a collaborative divorce is to have the least amount of damage to children and families during the divorce process. And even more than that is to provide you, the parents, with the skills you need for communication, co-parenting, conflict resolution, so that after your divorce process is completed, you're set up to go through life with your children and co-parent them effectively and not have to be putting them through things like, oh my gosh, I'm planning, high school graduation, but if mom and dad come, it's going to be a bad scene. Or I'm looking to get married, but geez, there's family drama. We can't invite both sides, things like that. So those, I would say, are the pros of a collaborative or a mediated approach. The cons, at least what seemed to be a con immediately, is that when one first comes into that space, one thinks, oh my gosh, you're telling me I'm going to have this team of professionals, which sounds great, except I'm paying each of these professionals an hourly rate. And you're talking about team meetings, 2 hours long, where I have 2 attorneys in the room and a Lydia version of coach or child specialist. And then maybe there's a Nicole or a Mary there because we need it. What is that? What are these meetings costing me? So initially, it can seem like a much more expensive process. As Joe pointed out, if you're in litigation and fighting, that can be a very expensive process. So pros and cons everywhere. I'll stop there so that we can move on, but open to other questions.
Well, I think it's important to also point out with one of the cons with collaborative is that if it falls apart, if either Joe or Lydia, if you want to kind of address that from a legal perspective, what that means for a client.
Sure. I'll jump in and just say that the attorneys who are involved in a collaborative divorce must commit at the beginning of the process to withdrawing from the case if they're not successful. And so if we're not successful as a collaborative team in coming to agreement, the attorneys part of those process have to withdraw. And that means that if the husband and wife decide to go into a litigated process, they have to hire brand new attorneys and start from scratch. That serves to be a pro in the sense that we all in a collaborative process are really incented to make it work. Nobody gains from there being a fight. An attorney can't be saying, oh, well, if we don't work this out here, I get to go battle this out in court, because he or she does not. It will be a different attorney at play.
Right. Well, I think that's why we wanted to point out that it is a pro and a con, because if it doesn't work out, you do have to push the reset button, which I think, and Joe, I guess I would have you weigh in, is that's where it's really important for you to share with your attorney what is happening and why you're going through the divorce process, but your perspective on your partner and how cooperative he or she might be going through the collaborative. Because sometimes if it's a really antagonistic, and at the end, we want everybody to be whole, but I think it's critical at the beginning of your process to do a really good assessment about whether or not you're going to cooperate as well as your soon-to-be former spouse.
That's very true, Mary Beth. I mean, there are some couples that are ideally situated for the collaborative process, but then that you have clients that would rather throw a vase at each other than be in the same room with each other, and perhaps for those people another way is preferable. But that's where it's incumbent on the client to be honest with their attorney.
Right.
Anything you tell me or any other attorney is protected by the attorney-client privilege, which means I can't disclose it to anyone. So if you're going to be honest with anybody, it should be me. Because if I have to find out something later, or God forbid, find something out from opposing counsel that you should have told me, I'm probably not going to be very happy about that. And it could lead to a misalignment of goals and plans to get us where you'd like to be. So please be honest. And if I could circle back around to something Nicole said at the beginning regarding pro se representation. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, pro se means that you decide to represent yourself in your divorce. That is certainly your right. And sometimes people who are more financially sophisticated or perhaps are pretty high up or maybe even captains of industry in their own area think that they should be able to do this pretty competently. But I always kind of lick my chops when I see that the other side isn't represented. I always tell people, you're about to enter an arena where everybody else is a professional and does this for a living, except for you. Is that really a good idea? Probably not.
Well, and I to further that, Abraham Lincoln said, anybody that represents himself in court has a fool for a client. So, and because yes, you have every right, but Joe knows the nuances of different laws and also has had great familiarity with the judges in the various counties and how they generally might see a case, and probably has experience in how it's been decided previously. So, certainly if that's your option that you want to pursue, we wish you luck, but we would not necessarily make that our top suggestion or top choice. So
I think before we move on, and I'm happy to do it, but if Joe or Lydia, maybe we can just spend, like, I know, again, we could all talk a week on this, but we mentioned collaborative and mediation. Do we maybe just want at a high level define, like, how does that process work? And if you're comfortable saying, like, I have found, this type of situation might lend itself better to mediation over collaboration or vice versa.
Well, I jumped in last time. So Joe, do you want to start?
I can talk about mediation for
Okay, perfect.
Mediation is where the divorcing parties sit down with a mediator who is a neutral third party. They don't represent either one of the divorcing people. And they try and facilitate discussion and dialogue and ideas and try and help the parties reach some sort of agreement that everybody can live with. But they don't file things, generally speaking, for the parties. They don't always draft documents. They're really just there to see if there's anything the parties can agree on, and if so, how much. And I think mediation is probably ideal for people who maybe don't have children or have children who are older, or perhaps both have very normal 9-to-5 jobs, very traditional assets like a house and a 401k, as opposed to people who are really arguing over custody and parenting time, and as opposed to people who have unusual jobs with unusual compensation arrangements, or who have a lot of assets. It just makes it sort of unwieldy once it hits a certain point.
I've also found when I've been working with someone who's going through a divorce and they're trying to mediate or they're talking about mediation, one situation, and again, I'm not saying always, but in my experience, what I've seen is if there's an imbalance of power, oftentimes the person who holds the power and the knowledge about the finances and, you know, is the one who, in their view, is going to be losing on the divorce side, that they oftentimes will suggest mediation because they feel like that's great. We've got this impartial party. I'll be able to kind of continue to drive the bus. And here's my spreadsheet and how I think things should be allocated. And they're going to approve it and we'll call it a day. So I've seen those situations where mediation's been attempted and it may not have been the best path for the person who in the marriage at least was not holding all the cards. So from that, I'm going to kind of tee it up to Lydia to say perhaps collaboration may be a way if you want to still do one of the alternative dispute resolutions. And I know I think all of us have seen where there's been imbalance of power and collaborative has been effective and a good choice for the couple.
Sure. I'll start by saying I second everything Joe said, pretty much about mediation. I'll add a little in. But as you were talking earlier, Joe, it reminded me that yes, one of the big differences there between a litigated divorce, right, and any kind of alternative dispute resolution is that in ADR, as we call it, you often have a neutral party or even more than one neutral party on the team, which is a very different dynamic. So it absolutely requires that both spouses are able to advocate for themselves, advocate for their wants and needs, speak up, have a voice. And when I'm assessing a couple to try to make the determination on whether or not they'd be appropriate for collaborative or mediation, that's one of the things I'm very much looking for. Because if one of the parties, as Nicole just said, if there's a strong power imbalance, whether it's due to lack of knowledge about the finances or just psychological processes going on, I'll be the first one to say, you know what, I think you need an attorney because you need an attorney to be your voice in this process. So that doesn't mean that I immediately am going to say, okay, off you go to litigation. Because to segue back to a collaborative divorce model, in a collaborative divorce model, each party does have their own attorney, but it's a collaboratively trained attorney who's not there to work against the other, but to work with the other. The other requirement for any sort of collaborative process is full disclosure and a commitment to full disclosure about all finances, about everything and anything that's going on that would be relevant to the case. The client pledges that at the beginning and has to sign that on the agreement. And if it's found during the process that one or both parties did not do that, then that right there can nullify the process. The other thing that makes collaborative divorce, the official collaborative divorce, different is that, okay, you've each got your own attorney, so you do have that person there advocating for you and your legal rights and your needs, but you also typically have at least one, if not two, neutral parties as part of the process. And that's where a Nicole or a Mary would come in as a neutral party to bring up and run the numbers and look at the finances and make sure everyone understands completely what's going on financially. And then you'd have someone like me, whether a coach or a family child specialist. You might have two coaches, depending on the parties. But so it gives you this really full, wow, I've got this whole team, some of whom I know are kind of in my court if I need to feel like there's my court, right, with my attorney. But I also have neutrals and others I can learn from and who will coach me. So I think with a power dynamic there and power imbalances, I'd agree with Joe, mediation, maybe not the best case. Collaborative is more supportive. That said, the last case that I mediated, and I think we all know this, it's tough to know, right? someone comes into your office and they present and, oh yes, I'm able to speak my mind and I'm able to do what I need to do. And then you get going in the process and realize not so much. In the last case that I mediated, that happened. One of the parties was much better able to advocate for their needs. The other was not. The financial piece was not complicated, but the parenting piece was. And there was parental alienation going on and all kinds of complications. I brought in a team. I brought in a financial neutral to help at least neutralize and get the finance piece off the table and not have that be influencing the parenting piece. And I relied greatly on my team and my network of professionals out there and consulted with a couple of attorneys. I sent the couple, after we had drafted the memorandum of understanding, which is what a mediator writes up, and that's what I send to an attorney to write up into the legal language. I made sure to consult with several attorneys who I felt would be very good at coaching this couple through the issues that I felt were not balanced enough and that they had not made enough progress with me doing. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you all for discussion on that topic. So we're going to move on, shift to a different topic real quick, and we're going to start off with Joseph. So what is the best way to protect your assets in a divorce?
Well, the best way to protect your assets in a divorce is actually to do something before you even get married. And that's a prenuptial agreement. That's the single best way to protect your assets. But assuming you're already married, ways that you can protect yourself in a divorce is number one, first of all, know what your assets are. If you're not the spouse that's traditionally been involved with the financial side of things, you need to get involved and determine, number one, what's out there, and number two, where it's at. And then once you have a handle on that, you have a couple of different options. One option is to get with your financial advisor and start making a plan. You'd be surprised at how few people actually plan for a divorce, even if they know it's coming or if they've been served with papers. Another thing you can do is to take a look at 2 or 3 years down the road. If you're not the breadwinner in your family and a divorce is likely, should you really be out there looking for a job? You know, should you be socking money away in various financial vehicles, or should you be paying down debts? You know, there are a lot of things to consider based on the facts of your case. You need to come up with a strategy to address those. And that's why running things by an attorney, running things through your financial advisor are very important, because what's appropriate for one person might not be appropriate for another person with a different fact pattern. But the first step is identifying what the financial assets are.
Joe, since you brought up the prenuptial, do you want to just quickly address like what a postnuptial is and
Sure.
whether or not it can be appropriate in some circumstances?
Sure. Just by way of contrast, a prenuptial agreement is a contract that people enter into before they get married, which pre-addresses how things are going to be divided and dealt with in the event of a divorce. A post-nuptial agreement is a contract that people can enter into after they're already married, which also addresses certain topics and very often is used to determine in advance how things like assets and debts are going to be divided. The main difference between the two is that with a prenuptial agreement, the parties can generally agree to anything they want as long as it doesn't involve children and isn't against, public policy. But with a postnuptial agreement, there has to be consideration. And by consideration, I mean that in exchange for entering into this post-nuptial agreement, one or both of the parties have to do something in exchange. For instance, a very common thing with post-nuptial agreements is, somebody might really, really, really want the house in case they get divorced. But there has to be consideration in a post-nup. So maybe in exchange for getting the house, maybe the party also agrees that the other side is going to get 60 or 65% of the retirement. With a post-nuptial agreement, there has to be give and take. With a prenuptial agreement, you can do whatever you want. So that's the main difference.
Okay. Thank you.
Would you guys like to move on to the next question? I think Joseph brought up the children in divorce, so I think that's a nice leeway to a question for Lydia, actually. And that question is, how do I protect my children and not have them hurt during the divorce?
So it's funny, I was actually thinking as you were talking, Joe, because I worked on a collaborative prenuptial agreement last year for several months, helping coach a couple through this. So if we have time later, I'd like to talk about that a little bit because it's another way that we can do it as a team. But how to protect the children, very important. It's always kind of my focus on the team, whether I'm hired as the divorce coach, whether I'm hired as the child and family specialist, or I'm the mediator. And I often tell clients when we're interviewing each other, they're interviewing me or I'm interviewing them, that even though you're the person signing the agreement, and obviously you are my client, if you have children, my real client is your children. My real client, the first thing I'm thinking about always is your family, your children, and their well-being. And by default, hopefully that means it's your well-being, not always. How to protect the children in the case of a divorce is, I'll say that the first and foremost thing is do whatever you can to not expose them to conflict. What our research tells us is that children who are exposed to conflict are the ones who have the most difficult outcomes and problems going forward in life. And that's regardless of whether or not their parents got divorced or didn't get divorced. The flip side of that is that children whose parents got divorced, but were able to do so without exposing the children to conflict, have much better outcomes developmentally, socially, emotionally, cognitively, than children whose parents remained in a marriage or relationship that had a lot of conflict. So that is the most important thing. I also realize for most couples, that is the most difficult thing, because it's usually not a happy process if they're deciding to get divorced. And not all couples are arguing or fighting or in conflict a lot of the time, but many of the couples, by the time they get to me or us on a team, are. So how do you do that? Because easier said than done, right? I always tell people, if you're not in therapy already, get yourself some supportive therapy. You need someone that you can talk with, who will be objective, who will, again, be in your court, so to speak, who you can bounce ideas off of. Someone who has training in family and child development would be ideal, because they would help you with forming ways to act and ways to do things that won't harm your children. But get support. I always advocate for, a team approach if possible, because some people need that. When you're first at that first stage and you haven't even told the children yet about the divorce, I was just talking with a couple about this yesterday. It's so important that the messaging to the children be consistent from both parents. In the ideal situation, you both sit down with the children and you tell them in a very calm manner. You plan how to do it. This is something that you would do with me if I were your therapist. You would do it with me if I were your coach. This would be something that we might spend an hour or more figuring out. What's the best time of day? What's the best day in the next 3 weeks, depending on what's going on in the family, what activities, if any, the children may have, what's coming up over the next month or two for them. But in general, I tell parents, you don't have to know everything about what's going to happen in terms of the divorce. Oftentimes parents are feeling like, I don't even know what's going to happen. I don't know what's happening with the house. I don't know what's happening with my job, so I can't tell them. And I say, no, you don't have to know everything that's happening. The important messaging for the kids is that this is going to happen and mom and dad are going to take care of it. And mom and dad are going to take care of you children, and you children have nothing to do with why this decision has been made. So that's kind of the overview of how to protect children, at least at the beginning.
We call it the big four. You know, your whether your mom and dad or whoever is on the other side, we're getting divorced. Number two, it's not your fault. This is just between us. We both love you very much, and everything's going to be okay.
Beautiful. Next time we'll throw that question to you.
I also
Cool.
think you bring up a great point, Lydia. It's again about getting a therapist, because Nicole and I hear this all the time about, like, they say, or I've heard that, and there's this Greek chorus around so many of our clients that they say, well, so-and-so got this and so-and-so got that. And we always take a step back and say, first of all, every divorce, like every individual, is unique. So whatever happened in anybody else's divorce may or may not happen within yours, but also the fact that you need somebody that's independent, because your family loves you. And so they don't want to see you hurt. So they're going to continue to say, yeah, the other party's bad, 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 bad. And they may very well be, but you need somebody objective that can really help get you on that path to recovery, because sometimes your family just doesn't know what to do, because we're not licensed therapists like
Right.
you are. So, and I would say Nicole and I hear a lot of things, but we're not licensed therapists either. So we always say it's really important to have a coach or a therapist on your team. And maybe, Nicole Young, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but maybe it would be a good time to take that distinction between a coach and what a therapist will do for you as you go through the process.
Well, I'd like to jump just and respond to that and what Joe said, because Joe, I love that big four. I actually haven't heard that before, but as you were talking, Mary Beth, I thought actually maybe, Joe, we come up with a hybrid, the big five, because there was one point I didn't say that is incredibly important that I do want to get out in terms of protecting your children in a divorce. And that is, don't trash the other parent. It's also sometimes the hardest thing to do, because there's a reason you're divorcing that person, right? And when I say don't trash, don't speak negatively, when I'm going to define that, I mean, don't speak negatively about the other person. The harder part is the eye rolling, the expressions, the things that we'll do, right? When you say, oh, I never said a word about her or a word about him. But every time the child brings up mom or dad, you're rolling your eye or harumphing. So those are the things that really hurt kids in a divorce. And those are the things that I'll tell you as a therapist and just as a human being are the most understandable things that are happening, because you're in a divorce and it's a tough situation. And that's why, again, yeah, I get a therapist, get some help, join a support group. But as Mary Beth pointed out so clearly, yeah, you will talk to family, you'll talk to friends, but they want to support you. And for some people, that means rah-rah-rahing with everything you say, whether it's good or not. And that, yeah, it can serve to do more damage than you thought.
Well, and I think you don't also want to, I think we've probably all seen, right, where you fatigue your family or friends, because understandably this can be or is all consuming of you. But if that's all you can talk about, and if you're going through divorce, it's probably not going to be a positive conversation thread. Kind of just be mindful of that too, because you don't want to alienate your social network or your support group. So I think that, and the other thing I wanted to add on to Lydia about not trashing the other parent is not only with the child or friends and family, but also be very cautious about not posting about all this on social media. Yeah. So whether it's, you may, even if you thought, oh, I went back and deleted the post, I think we all know at this point, nothing ever goes away. I'm sure Joe has many stories, not that I'm asking you to share, but we've all heard about posts coming into court, or that gets to be part of discovery. I've heard stuff that I'm like, wow, are you sure this wasn't a storyline from the most recent, Real Housewives of ... on Bravo? So just be very aware of not posting, and also just even who you're verbally talking to, because things can be recorded, screenshots, forwarded, right? All the things. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why, whether it's your therapist, your priest, your someone, you need to have, you need a place, you need that outlet. So I'm not saying don't say negative things about your soon to be ex-spouse. I'm saying don't say them to your kids or to anyone from whom your kids may hear it. And that was the mantra I used when I was getting divorced. And I didn't want, I knew I wasn't going to say anything to my children, but I also knew if I say something to Auntie so-and-so or Mrs. so-and-so from church or from the school group, there was a chance, right? People gossip, they're talking to their family, it might get to some, and I thought, I don't want my children to ever hear anything negative about their dad and know that it had somehow originated with their mom. And that meant, who could I talk to? A very few close friends who I knew would not pass it on, and a therapist because confidentiality.
Well, several years ago when we did a similar webinar to this, we had somebody say, if you say something bad about the parent and knowing that your child is half of that person, basically, you're communicating to your child, not only that you not like the parent, but there's a lot of that child that they don't like. And that's really hurtful. And so I think if you can kind of think about it in that context, is that, it's not just hurting the child to hear about what their dad or mom may have done wrong. It's also, hey, I'm half of my mom or dad. So, and it goes back to one of Joe's points, I think, I will still love you. But if you're saying those things on and on, it's going to be hard for them to believe that you still do. So
Right.
Just something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I'll quickly respond to, you started the question about difference between a therapist and a coach, unless you wanted to jump somewhere else.
No, I think that would be very helpful because, what we want to make sure that people take away is the team concept here.
Okay. So what I tell people is, when I'm working as a therapist, which I do because I have private practice, right? I'm working with someone on certain goals that they have in life or certain difficulties that they're dealing with. And that oftentimes that then bounces us back into their past experiences, whether it's childhood or any other experiences they've had. And we may spend time there looking at those experiences and what happened to try to help them understand where they are now to try to get them forward and achieving the goals they want. So that's when I'm in the identity as therapist, right? When I'm working as a coach or as a family specialist with a couple getting divorced, I am always much more future focused. So it doesn't mean I don't want to hear about something if they want to tell me some connection that they've made or triggers that they know about. But I am not going to spend a lot of time trying to help them. And one of the metaphors we use in the collaborative space is, as therapists, I may help you pack and unpack your bags 100 or 1,000 times, right? We all have baggage that we're carrying around with us every day. And as therapists, we're going to unpack it, we're going to pack it up, we're going to unpack it, pack it up. As your divorce coach, I'm here. You showed up with that big bag. It looks really heavy. I'm going to take one end, you take the other, and I'm going to help you carry it over the finish line without unpacking it and repacking it. But hopefully by giving you the skills that you need and helping coach you in such a way that even with that bag that you have in hand, we can get you to the finish line in a very productive and hopefully non-traumatic way for your family. So
thanks for clarifying, Lydia. And guys, we have about 5 more minutes, maybe a little bit more, but I'd like to get to our 2 remaining questions. So I'm just going to send one over to Mary Beth and Nicole real quickly. And that question is, what if I'm not the one who generally deals with the finances?
Nicole, you want to take that?
Why don't you start and then I'll add on.
Okay. Well, first of all, we get this question all the time. And Nicole always says you have to be a Nancy Drew for yourself. Or for some people that may be a reference that you recognize or not. But basically, you need to be your own advocate and your own personal detective. And there are a lot of ways that we can help you, but there are a lot of documents that just off the bat, you can start to collect. If, in this day and age, you're probably not getting a lot of statements mailed to you, but if you can gain access to passwords and things like that, tax returns and all that kind of good stuff has a trove of information. It's a treasure trove of information. And I'm going to let Nicole talk about that and kind of so we
Sure.
can tag team.
Yeah, I was just gonna say then exactly, we can go back and forth. So yeah, if you know, of course we have a document checklist, your attorney probably, most of the professionals will, and that can be a little overwhelming, especially again, if you were not involved at all or were only minimally involved with the finances. So if anything, if you can get a copy of your tax return, the full boat, not just the first 1 page or 2 pages, but all the supporting schedules and documents and statements that would have been submitted to the accountant. Even if it seems to be written in Greek to you, by working with a financial planner, especially a certified financial planner, although we don't prepare tax returns, we are very used to and adept at reading and interpreting them. And that's a great starting point because it will have links to really almost anything that touches you financially, whether it's an asset you own, a loan that you owe to someone. A financial planner will be able to help you, kind of like we said, put on your Nancy Drew hat and start to put together either lists of questions or other documents, and we can help you prioritize what to get next. Now you might say, well, gosh, Mary Beth and Nicole, if I wasn't involved in the finances, the only thing I did with the tax return was sign it. So I mean, I know who our accountant is, but I don't have a relationship with him or her. Well, if it's a joint tax return, you're a client of the accountant as well. And so they have to send you, you can request copies of these documents. Now, a couple of tips. If your spouse owns, maybe they're a business owner or they're a partner in a law firm or a wealth management firm, there might be other entities that feed into that joint return. And if you're not a member or owner, you might not at this point in time be able to get some of the other kind of supporting or outline documents. But don't worry, you will get it at some point in time. Whatever process you choose, it will be part of the discovery or data gathering. The other thing I want to add before I tip it back to Mary Beth is, if you're in the contemplating stage and you haven't yet talked to your spouse that you're thinking about divorce, again, if you're calling the accountant and you've never really interacted with him or her, they might be like, that's interesting. Why is Nicole calling me asking for the last 3 years of tax returns? So again, you're entitled to the info, but just remember, just like your client, so is the spouse. And the accountant may call them to say, hey, just wanted to let you know, Nicole called me today or called my office and was requesting all this information. So we just wouldn't want you to do something to tip your hand, because as Lydia had referred to, just like you want to be thoughtful about how and when you tell your children, probably with your spouse as well, if this has not been an already kind of ongoing topic.
And to that end, whatever information you collect, we definitely recommend that you either keep it on a flash drive or some kind of mechanism that can be separate from your personal computers that either you or your spouse have. It could be a trusted friend that you give all the documents to. You can open up a safety deposit box at a bank. If you also, that's another, there's a lot of different avenues, but the idea is you're starting to accumulate these different pieces of information about your financial life. Keep it separate, because you don't want to have to go and do it again. And if you're working with a financial planner, they will also keep a copy. So just something to protect yourself too. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here, and it's 12:50, so we just have a couple more minutes. Joseph, do you want to try and answer one last question before we wrap up?
Sure.
All right, so the final question of our webinar will be, are there ways to stack the financial deck in your favor?
Are there ways to stack the financial deck in your favor? Yes, there are. Number one, make a complete list of all of your assets and dets, and know the the account numbers, know where they're located, know what their value is. Number two, sit down with your financial advisor and try and figure out what you're going to need after the divorce so that you come up with a number and a mix of assets and debts. Number three, you're going to want to take a look at what your lifestyle has been, whether or not you've been working or not working, whether you're the breadwinner or not the breadwinner, and make decisions on your future employment based on that partially. If you know, I always tell people that part of being a divorce attorney is, to use a Star Wars analogy, you've got two toolboxes. You've got your Jedi toolbox and you've got your Sith toolbox. And some of the things that you employ for your client come from the Jedi toolbox, and some of them come from the Sith toolbox, depending upon what you're trying to accomplish. And there are specific things you can pull from each, depending on your specific scenario. Not to give away the secret sauce necessarily, but a very common technique is to put the house into a trust, make the kids the beneficiaries, but make yourself alone the trustee. That way you remove it from the marital pool and essentially prevent your spouse from getting at it. So there are a lot of different techniques you can employ. I suggest that you sit down with your attorney and your financial advisor and figure out what makes the most sense for you. But there are absolutely ways you can stack the financial deck in your favor.
Great. Thank you for your insight there, Joseph, and everybody else. It's about that time. So thank you for all of your comments, thoughts, and insight into this very complicated situation. As it's almost 1 p.m., we're going to, of course, wrap up here in about 7 minutes. But before we do, we'd like to leave you with a kernel of wisdom from each of our panelists. So if you wouldn't mind maybe getting us started and sharing yours, Mary Beth.
Oh, we've talked about so many of them already. I guess as you contemplate whether you're going to go through the divorce and which process is best, I also really, I know I'm the finance person, but I think you take care of yourself too, because, you know, make sure you're getting good sleep, make sure that, you know, you're eating well and things like that, because the emotional part of this process will cloud your judgment. And that's why Nicole and I are on your team to be able to help clarify for you, but it's also really important to us to make sure that you're well, because the process of divorce is one thing, but we want to make sure that, you know, we always call it the next chapter. We want to make sure that next chapter is as good as it can be for you after the divorce is final. Do you want me to toss it? Okay, I'll toss it to Lydia.
Gosh,
I have the ball.
I have several kernels, I guess, of wisdom. But I think the first, what I'm going to come out with, at the risk of offending Joe, but Joe, we're all friends here. What I say to everyone who I meet who is contemplating divorce, or, you know, even going in the process, is that if you want to have the most control of your divorce process and the pace of your divorce, do not file first, as in do not do what traditionally is what's recommended, which is go to an attorney. And I will say, by all means, go to an attorney, consult with an attorney, consult with 3, but do not jump the gun to actually file for your divorce and get the courts involved. Because once the court is involved, you have lost control of the pacing. You then will have, you know, in my case, it was every 30 days, a hearing or some sort of check-in, which requires your attorney to respond. And you may not have anything happen within that 30-day period. You know, it takes time to figure out whether it's what we're doing for a parenting schedule, parenting plan, finances. So that's I think the most important thing. Second thing, it takes a village, takes a team. And that doesn't mean you have to do it from a collaborative divorce perspective or a mediation, but just in life. So as Mary Beth pointed out, as part of your self-care, have a team behind you and make sure some of those people at least can be objective, neutrals, therapist, priest, someone, right? So that you have varying degrees of information and advice coming your way. I'll toss it to Joe. So you can rebut.
Oh, no. I would echo to some extent what Lydia said. You know, you're never going to have more control over how your divorce ends than if the two of you come to an agreement, right? Because otherwise somebody else is going to impose a solution on you.
Right.
But as far as my my kernels of wisdom, number one, you should have a plan. It doesn't have to be a great plan, but you should have a plan. Even a mediocre plan is better than no plan. I mean, if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. And the second thing, to echo what Mary Beth said, you know, this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. The process is emotional. There are things that are going to come at you out of left field that you didn't anticipate. So rather than get swallowed up by the quicksand, you need to learn to dance on the shifting carpet to some extent. You know, if you go back to ancient history, you know, the Spartans facing off against the Persian army, you know, at one point the Persian ambassador says, you know, our arrows are going to blot out the sun. And the Spartan responds with, then we'll fight in the shade. You know, you have to be willing to roll with the punches and not let things upset you inordinately, and realize that to some extent, whoever can endure the longest is probably going to get the upper hand, at least in a litigation scenario. So if you're somebody that Nicole referred to who is on the short end of the power dynamic, and you know, tends to get steamrolled or bullied by their spouse, you're going to want to pick an advocate or someone who can really push back for you.
Right.
So that's something to consider as well. But have a plan, and you know, get ready to jump around a little bit. Don't be the pillar that's so rigid that it breaks when the first wave hits it.
Those are all great kernels of wisdom. I guess with mine, I echo everything you all have said and I can never remember who said this. So I'm not even going to try to attribute it to the person, but you know what? When you're going through a divorce, don't look backwards. You're not going that way. So even though you are, maybe if you're talking with your therapist or even your family or whatever, sure, you're going to remember the good times, the bad times, the things like that. But with the divorce, you want to try to say, I agree 100% what Joe just said, is you need to have a plan. And there's going to be different aspects of that plan. Mary Beth and I always say with your team or the divorce, it's like a three-legged stool. There's the legal, there's the financial, and then there's the emotional or mental health aspects. And so regardless of the process that you're choosing to use for your divorce, again, generally speaking, it really will behoove you and benefit you to have the right people on your team. You know, as Mary Beth alluded to, neither she nor I, you know, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I had one psychology class in college. So, you know, we're not trained on the mental health aspects. Certainly, again, we had one business law. And then the same thing, you know, now Joe does have a mental health background, but generally speaking, right, you have your people who are in their lane and that's what they stay abreast on, and what are the current trends, the current laws, and what do they eat, live, and breathe every day. So we have found that the clients who come out the most whole is they have a team to address each leg of their stool. And generally speaking, they allow themselves or allow their team to guide them to look forward. What's next? What, you know, and you may not know, and it'd be, you know, most times people don't say, oh, here, Nicole, here's my PowerPoint of what my next 10 years are going to look like. They're like, holy cow, I don't know where I'm going to be living next week, versus you want my expenses in 10 years. But the more you start to write things down and you just kind of, I know what Mary Beth and I do in our planning purposes, we start to kind of build guardrails or like ranges. And then as you progress, we can start to narrow that band. And it's really just you helping guide you to understand when you have your attorney and they're, you know, Joe's getting you the best settlement possible. That's his job, is to get you divorced And then he's not going to be there to say, should I stay in the house? Can I afford to refinance? I need to pay for 20% of college. How am I going to do that? Right? Do I need to work and things like that? And then the same thing, with Lydia, if you're looking, I'm going to start dating again, or, one of the kids is getting married. So it's having that team both during the divorce and then ongoing as you move forward. So regardless of how you get divorced, really be thoughtful about who you surround yourself with and have professionals with the various areas of expertise, and those who predominantly, doesn't have to be solely, but predominantly operate in the divorce arena. So that's my kernel. I apologize, I went on a little longer.
Oh, no, all of the kernels of wisdom were great. So I want to wrap things up. So I'm going to say thank you to Joe and to Lydia for joining us this afternoon. And we're very grateful for your willingness to share your thoughts and your expertise. We hope that all of you out there have gained the knowledge that you were looking for, and hopefully eased your mind and are better equipped to move forward with whatever path is best for you. If you would like a complimentary 30-minute consultation or have a specific question, please contact us. You have the information to contact us with our email addresses on your screen. And then we regularly host these events. As Nicole mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, Project Venus was started for women, but in this COVID world, we are extending this to anybody that you feel that can benefit from these kind of sessions. And to that end, our next session will be on November 10th, again at 12 noon, and we are going to be focusing on that very important issue for many in the divorce process, which is what to do with the house. And so we're going to have a mortgage broker as well as a real estate agent who is also certified in divorce situations join us for that particular session. So please let us know if you'd like to have you join us. We'll make sure that you get the registration information. So enjoy the rest of your day and your week. And again, thanks Joe and Lydia for being here with us, and to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Pleasure. Thank you.